there's this strong belief, of course, that we can't create anything that we haven't experienced. I got
Yes.
into a huge fight with an artist about this who said, that's crazy. And I said, okay, create an alien that doesn't have any eyes, scales, feathers, whatever. Create something that
Right.
doesn't exist.
I'm very pleased to introduce our guest today, Ross Grayson Bell. Ross Grayson Bell is a writer, producer, story consultant, and educator dedicated to deepening our understanding of ourselves and each other through the stories we tell. From developing and producing Fight Club in Hollywood to making a film about ABBA's donation of royalties to UNICEF to aid children in Guatemala, his commitment to impactful storytelling and organizations striving to effect positive change in the world has taken him to the four corners of the globe. After graduating from University of Sydney with first-class honors in economics, Ross has worked as a story executive and producer in Hollywood, a screenwriter for BBC Films in London, an online mentor to emerging writers, and as head of screenwriting at Australia's National Film School in Sydney. He has also served as a narrative strategist for companies combating climate change and promoting sustainability in the United States, Costa Rica, and Paraguay. Currently splitting his time between Los Angeles, Asunción, and Sydney, Ross is developing a documentary series about Indigenous life on Earth, highlighting the diversity, resilience, and interconnectedness that bind us all. He believes the universality of human experience is found in the specific details of our stories, and that by authentically telling those stories, we can transcend cultural boundaries to deeply connect with audiences worldwide. Well, hello, Ross. It's good to see you.
Hello, Jamie.
Yeah. How are things there? Are you in California currently?
Yes, it's been very wet, very wet. Um, Everybody in California, as soon as it rains, says, "Oh, we need it. We need it." But it rained for 3, 4 days solid, and it was a lot of water. So
Right.
uh,
Yeah.
I live near a community, San Clemente, and there are these cliffs, right?
Yeah.
Everybody wants the beach. And the only way a beach exists is by the erosion of the cliffs that
Sh-
they've built on the
sh-
cliffs. So there are big problems coming because these houses are falling into the sea.
Right. Right.
So we'll see what happens in
Wow.
the future.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I wasn't sure because your bio says that you split your time between the USA, Sydney, and Paraguay.
Yes, Paraguay
Yeah.
is one of the
Yeah.
interesting
Yeah.
places. Well, um, I'm actually heading there on Friday, and
hmm
we're working with the largest private landholder in Paraguay who has virgin forest, the Gran Chaco forest. And,
hmm
one of Paraguay's biggest exports is cattle. And so the forest is being plowed under to turn into cow pastures. I mean, the worst, a
Yes.
double whammy for climate change in terms of destroying a forest that's absorbing carbon and then putting cows on it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we're working to create the largest Red Plus project, which is a deforestation initiative launched by the United Nations some years ago, where you can buy a forest as a carbon offset for your carbon emissions.
hmm
And
hmm
there's the market, this carbon credit market, is actually going through a complete reassessment. There's been a lot of journalists out there debunking the actual benefit of the forests in terms of their and the science behind the amount of carbon that is sequestered.
hmm
Um, so the idea is you preserve the forest for 30 years and companies can buy the carbon credit. It's not an
Okay.
ideal situation in that you can still be a polluting company, greenwash your conscience by buying a forest in another country to
hmm
preserve it.
hmm
The idea is you should stop polluting, right? Or plant a new forest where one doesn't exist. But if this
Yeah.
forest is not valued, it will be plowed under because then it has economic value for the landholder. So
Sure.
that's too much information, most probably, but it's an
No, no,
interesting.
it's interesting because actually it touches on our work as well. Commonly, this is I mean the whole point of this podcast is life with strings attached, and those connections that we make in the first place. And your and my initial connection was through World Tree, which was again a sustainable materials conversation, and how it was, possibly effective within the guitar community through Brian Gallup, and a guitar that he had made with the Polonia wood that was part of that World Tree, which I believe was, if I remember the story correctly, it was President Jimmy Carter. Was an initiative that Jimmy Carter had done to bring in a renewable, sustainable wood source. Um, and then you were involved with an organization that was trying to implement that material in useful ways. I mean, that's not a direct connection to your work in Paraguay, but it certainly is not unrelated either.
No, there is a relation because the American that I'm working with in Paraguay also consulted for World Tree. So
Oh.
World Tree are the largest grower of Polonia in North and South America. Polonia is the world's fastest growing hardwood. It's a tree that matures in close to 10 years, 10 to 12
Hmm.
years, and when harvested, regrows from the stump up to 7 times. And
Right.
it comes from China. There is an invasive species and a non-invasive species variety,
Hmm.
which World Tree, of course, are propagating the non-invasive one. But it's been used in
Hmm.
China for years for instruments. It's a very
Hmm.
light wood. It's like the balsa wood. It's very light but very strong.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, and one of the applications for this lumber is uh, guitars and musical instruments. And when I was working for the company, I looked into the fact that the guitar industry is facing a shortage of these traditional tone woods. And,
Hmm.
as a non guitar person, I never really thought that the industry was in trouble. I didn't realize that this wood, you just imagine the wood is always going to be there.
Hmm.
And I
Hmm.
remember reading an article by Bob Taylor, who had started this urban wood initiative where he was bringing in
Yeah.
old telegraph poles and things and making guitars out of them as
Hmm.
sort of a to highlight the fact that this shortage is going to be creating problems coming going forward. And then
Hmm.
more
Hmm.
I read about it, um, Polonia is likened to swamp ash, which is also disappearing.
Oh.
Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
so if you could
Due
have
to a
a
beetle
farmed or
infestation.
is beetles, is it? Ah.
It's an emerald ash boring beetle, which is an invasive species, which is taking out the ash trees in North America. Yeah, yeah.
But is there in the guitar industry, is there any farmed wood? Is it all sourced from old
Well,
growth forests? Or
I mean, well, there is now. Um, so you mentioned Bob Taylor and the Taylor Guitar Company. They bought forests or plantations of ebony in India or Africa or maybe both. I don't quite remember, but that's where it's indigenous to, is that sort of area of the world between Africa and India. Um, and so ebony is one of those things. And part of what they also did was that their ebony is favored because of its dark color. Of course, its density, also material properties, but also the fact that it's almost black at sections. But the sapwood, where the nutrients are growing up on the outside of the tree, is actually quite light. And because the black parts were favored for things like piano keys and guitar fretboards and violin fretboards and such, they were just discarding portions of the tree
ah,
that weren't black. And so now within our industry, we're using those lighter colored portions of the tree, which are still quite useful. And we think it's one argues that it's also beautiful. There's a natural beauty involved in in the variation in color and the high contrast and such, And so that's a part of the conversation. But I think that old growth is certainly a part of it. But I mean, let's face it. Before the Industrial Revolution, everything was kind of old growth. Right? You didn't cut down the new trees. It was sort of on mass consumption that you moved through all of the old trees and then went to younger and younger trees. And so there's a interesting sort of conversation to be had about the older trees versus the younger trees, and well, also what we're learning in science is about as far as the connectivity of trees and the communication throughout a forest. That a forest is one large ecosystem, that was sort of almost one nervous system. That the the one type of tree serves this function within the nervous system of the entire forest. And when we crop plant trees for renewable wood sources, we don't yet fully understand that to grow X tree actually requires Y tree to be mixed in with that tree, because they don't exist as individuals in the forest space. If that makes sense to you? Yeah.
That's
So,
that's
so,
very interesting. Yeah,
yeah, there's certain ones that generate perhaps more nitrogen, let's say. And I'm not educated enough on this, but I have listened to some experts talk about it where, let's say X tree is very good at contributing nitrogen to the ecosystem, whereas Y tree is not particularly good with nitrogen, but it gets it through X tree, right? And so the
right.
two together develop a sympathetic or a symbiotic relationship within the forest. And so, and then there's further complication with what those larger or older trees do. For instance, and we're a bit off track here. I'm going to go there anyways. So, elephants, in reserves, if you they realize they have to eventually cull the elephants. Oh no, I have my reactions on my screen. Pardon me. I'll try. um, if you don't cull the elephants, they will eventually just get rid of all the trees because of the lack of natural predators and such. So they were culling the elephants, and they thought, oh, the oldest ones have lived long enough. We'll cull the oldest ones and let the young ones live. The problem is the young males basically learn their civility and how to behave within culture from the older males. So they had all these young elephants rampaging, like going around and causing destruction. They were basically teenagers completely out of control because the older males weren't there to keep them in line. And so we have these complex social structures that might even exist within the biodiversity of a forest. And so the idea of strictly cropping trees for use, I think we have a lot to learn there still.
Look, I agree, and World Tree also, because they found that investors were not interested in monocrops. You
Yeah.
can do silver pasture, which is the cattle in amongst the trees. There's a number of different options now, because also if you have a monoculture, a monocrop, if there is a pest, like you mentioned earlier, it could wipe out the whole harvest.
Yeah.
So, um, but they do grow in a number of different countries, the tree, for that reason. So if something happened in the US, the trees in Costa Rica would still survive. Um,
Right.
no,
Right.
as soon as we change anything, it seems the knock on effect is to our detriment always.
Well,
Um,
I mean, yeah, we find the balance. The earth is incredibly resilient. Our cultures are resilient. We are constantly correcting course. And that's just the way life is. So,
yeah.
so you're doing a project currently in Paraguay. Again, it's connected to trees, and actually, interestingly enough, Polonia again, which I didn't understand that part of it. And so, you've been spending a
Polonia, the Polonia in
Mhm.
Paraguay will be for for fuel,
Okay.
because again, you don't want to be introducing a foreign tree into a forest, so that will be
Yeah.
farmed. Um, but
Hmm.
the consultant that links World Tree and Paraguay, he's an expert on Polonia. Um, but
Okay.
this is to preserve the forest as is and to actually rely on indigenous knowledge to harvest seeds, to propagate trees. So, in the denuded areas, the degraded areas on the edge of the forest, they can be
Hmm.
replenished. Um,
Hmm.
because how the carbon
Hmm.
credits work is if you have social programs tied to preserving the forests, the
Yeah.
value of the carbon credit goes up.
Hmm.
So if you're enhancing uh, work opportunities so people aren't illegally in the forest logging for their own preservation, right? You can't deny people a chance to survive. So you
Yeah.
have to make sure there's alternatives. Um, so while the forest is preserved, they can still maintain their lifestyle. Um,
Sure.
and really what has become more interesting to me on some levels, you know, there's the forest, but there are the social programs and the people who live in the forests,
Hmm.
and have relied on the forest for, centuries, and their culture.
Sure.
Um,
Hmm.
so you can't have these programs without preserving the forest without social programs. You have to run the two together.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um,
Hmm. And you're doing
so
a film about this, a documentary style film. Is that
this
correct?
is
Or
early stages. It is early
uh-huh.
stages. When I was in Australia last, I was working with an Indigenous community in the Kimberley, which is the northwest of Western Australia.
Hmm.
And there are huge problems out there with alcohol, drug abuse. And there was a young Guniandi man, that's the language group, Guniandi, who
Hmm.
turned away from drugs and alcohol and started taking troubled youth out into the bush to teach them the old ways,
Hmm.
to connect them to a culture that has existed for before white Australia existed.
Hmm.
Um, and the idea is to then tell that story of what he's doing, but then take him to Guatemala, where I've just made a film where I was working with the Kaichi community, um, in the mountains, and have them talk about culture and their
Hmm.
traditions and myths, and looking for the similarities. And then from
Hmm.
there, we'll take. So it's an Aboriginal man in the Kaichi community in Guatemala, and then we'll take somebody from there to the Inuits in Alaska, and then sub-Saharan Africa. So you
Hmm.
tell
Hmm.
the indigenous life on Earth. So imagine David Attenborough's wildlife, except we're
Hmm.
doing it with people. And
Right.
we tell the stories looking for the commonality, looking for the things that link us.
Hmm.
Because, and this comes to story, which is what we might be talking about, is that um, Joseph Campbell looked at myths across all cultures and found
Hmm.
there were so many similarities that he developed, his 12 stages of the hero's journey. Um,
Yes.
so, what is that? How can somebody who has no connection with Africa living in South America come up with the same
Right.
stories? What? So,
Yeah. So, I mean, you're referencing, I think, it's commonly known as the monomyth, right? I mean, that's the thing that he's best known for, right? The concept that you know, uh, all religions are true, but none of them are real. Basically, is what he has said. Is that, and that's what we see those commonalities throughout all of human culture. Is that we all have this in common, and they're all mostly true, but none of them are 100% correct. Was how I surmise it. Would you agree with that? Basically,
yes,
of what Campbell's theory was, basically.
yes, I would agree with that to some point, except there are stories of, fire coming from the sky
Hmm.
in traditional Indigenous, Australian Indigenous culture. And
Hmm.
they've actually tracked back to the dates. And there was a meteor that had come through at that point in that community,
Yep.
centuries ago, and that there are actually links to real events. So the stories have
Hmm.
evolved. Um, they haven't evolved from nothing. Uh,
Sure.
and there's this strong belief, of course, that we can't create anything that we haven't experienced. I got
Yes.
into a huge fight with an artist about this who said, that's crazy. And I said, okay, create an alien that doesn't have any eyes, scales, feathers, whatever. Create something that
Right.
doesn't exist. Um, so yes, I think that there's a stimulus that creates the story, and then it evolves over time. Um,
Sure.
so there is a
As we try
reality.
and explain what we have experienced, what we have seen, and sort of the empirical evidence, there was fire in the sky, but then we try and explain why that happened and perhaps the destruction and why things or people might have died in that. And I think those commonly were talked about as the gods are angry, because the only time that a human would enact such destruction on someone is because, oh, well, he must have been really pissed, right? Like really angry to make that
Right.
happen. But we don't have the power to do that. And so we literally take those concepts, like you talked about, the alien, the eyes, the mouth, right? The things we understand, and we try and fit this new information into our existing structure of narrative, right?
That's right. We have
Yeah.
to survive. And then you can.
Hmm.
Who was it? Was it Plato who said, "Those who tell stories rule society"? So that you can
Oh,
then take the
hmm.
story, frighten your children with it, get them to behave, bring people in
Yeah.
line according to how you manipulate the story, how you
Yeah.
the event and turn it into something.
Yeah.
Um,
That's an
and I'm
awful
not
way of
saying that's
parenting, by
bad.
the way. But yes, that's a
So,
that's an awful way to parent your children. But I've seen it done lots.
you know, the bogeymen, all the stories we've told, just to keep us safe. But
Yeah,
yeah,
there's other ways. But and that gets into the sort of discussion of education, sort of, or sort of accepting sort of open sort of markets versus sort of in uh tyrannical rule. At that point in time, we sort of say the ends justify the means. And so, I was in a grocery store recently, standing at the counter, and listened to a mom as a little girl walked away from her, and the mom's like, "I don't want to lose you. You don't want to lose me, do you?" And I'm like, "Oh my god!" Like, she's terrifying. Like, the manipulation, the open manipulation of this small little child. I'm like, "Why would you? You don't need to communicate that way with your child." And
I remember.
again, I'm going to go off on a tangent here. I firmly believe that children learn to lie from their parents, and that parents then reap the consequences of that. And that is part of the narrative. And so, that's where we get into morals and ethics around how we communicate things. And certainly that's very deeply connected to the Aboriginal and environmental themes that you're talking about, because there is a terrifying narrative that is being pushed about the environmental issues that I think honestly is unnecessary.
Mhm.
And that we don't have to terrify or regulate people into behaving correctly, that there are ways to incentivize them. And I noticed when I read your bio that you have a degree in economics. I didn't realize that. And so one of the basic observations that Adam Smith made when he created modern economics, basically, when he wrote the Wealth of Nations, was that you can reliably count on someone to take care of their own interests rather than hope for their benevolence. And he wasn't saying that people are selfish. He was just saying, like you mentioned, the people who rely on the forest to feed their families, you know, you can't just tell them they can't log anymore, starve. The planet needs you to starve now. That's that is not going to be a reasonable thing to ask them to do, right?
Right.
And so, how can we create a system that takes care of those people, those social programs you talked about, possibly, so that they are incentivized to act in a way that benefits us
Exactly.
all and doesn't have them cutting off their own nose to spite their face at some point in time. And that's
No,
and
that's
that is that communication, that narrative structure, which where both of us have alluded at introducing into our into our conversation today, because you are, of course, a professional storyteller. And that's how you met me in the first place. You interviewed me around that Polonia project, because of a guitar that Brian Gallup made in association with World Tree, and that we then took on tour with the Petite Guitar Showcase. And I remembered you being a professional storyteller, and I wanted to understand storytelling on the professional level a little more, and I reached back out to you. So the basis of our conversation is that storytelling. And so here we go. We've talked about Aboriginals, we've talked about the environment, and we've talked about sharing stories, and then the morality of, do you need to scare people or not, and the empirical understanding of what we see in real life, and then trying to make explanations within our existing framework. And so,
it's no, keep
yeah,
going.
did I sum it up right?
Yeah, oh, it was amazing actually.
Yeah,
Here I'm just free forming, and you're putting it all into categories, which is brilliant.
yeah,
Um, but I was talking recently to somebody about how we remember stories or why stories are important. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't know who said it, but if you want somebody to remember something, tell them a story.
Mm-hmm.
And they went on to explain, we grow up in a Christian American, North American society, and we all know of the 10 commandments, but can you name all 10?
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's presented as a list.
Yeah.
But not many people could, and that doesn't mean that people have a bad memory as such, or that they're not devout.
Mm-hmm.
But you'll remember the story of Adam and Eve. You'll remember the story of David and Goliath from the Bible, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it was told in a story. A list is
Mm-hmm.
like content now on social media. It's
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
information. But if you roll it into a story, um, then you're going to get emotional reaction, and people will remember that. Now, this comes from our evolution. If you're told a story that there is a tiger behind that tree and it did this to that child, the person listening to that story is going to remember it, and that enhances their chance of
Mm-hmm.
survival.
Sure.
So
And they
stories
still
are
get the bullet
intrinsic.
points. Tiger
They still
equals
get the
death.
bullet
Got it.
equals death. But they've
Yeah.
described it in a way so that you viscerally live. They've done all these science tests now, scans of the brain of what happens to the brain when you're told an emotional story. Different parts of the brain light up according to the story and the emotion, and chemicals are released that increase humans' willingness to cooperate.
Mm-hmm.
Oxytocin, I believe, is one of the chemicals. So that
Mm-hmm.
it is fundamental to how we started to group together in tribes, clans, and expand from there. And still to this day, you want to unite half of America in believing the election was a fraud? Tell them a good story,
Mm-hmm.
And Hitler did it. And time again, it's been used to
Mm-hmm.
nefarious ends, but it comes from an absolute human necessity. And we have survived and built the culture we have because of stories.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember once asking students screenwriting students, to talk about what differentiates us from animals. And, somebody came up with language and all these different things, but dolphins have language. Animals use tools, we've now discovered. So there are all these things that we used to think separated us from the animals. The
Mm-hmm.
only thing they haven't found an animal doing is recording their story. Right? Elephants are passing on knowledge somehow, but they're not leaving a
Mm-hmm.
written
Mm-hmm.
record. They haven't left a cave painting.
Yep.
And
Yep.
in some ways, that's what defines one way that we are defined, that we record our stories, and in doing so, create the culture. These get passed on. I've made a couple of films. They'll be here for the rest of time if we don't blow ourselves up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So storytellers are creating the culture. And I mean that from musicians to filmmakers to novelists, poets. Um, so it is such an important part of who we are. And it comes, people know how to tell stories, but when you actually break down how to do it, there's a real craft to it as well to become a good storyteller. Um, and I remember once, Ernest Hemingway did this. Can you tell
Mm-hmm.
a story in 6 words? Have I told you this
No.
before?
I'd like to hear it in six
Okay,
words, please.
6 words, right? So he challenged a group of his writer friends, and
You're
nobody
already over 6 words, Ross.
Okay. The 6 words. Right. Yeah,
Give it to me in
I'll
six
back up.
words. No?
No, I've got to give you a setup. You've got to have a setup. Um, our
All right.
job as storytellers, our only job as storytellers is to engage an audience. And you, as a
Yeah.
communicator, Jamie, how do you
Yeah.
engage your audience? Actually, I'll come to the 6 words in a second. How do you
Mm-hmm.
engage
Mm-hmm.
an audience?
How do I engage an audience? Well, I do it in multiple ways. I'm probably best known for the Boutique Guitar Showcase on tour at NAMM show. And I will tell you, I do that with narrative. So, a qualifier to be in the Boutique Guitar Showcase is that you're making a unique world class instrument that is contributing to the conversation of the guitar. And then during our events, we engage with attendees to get to know them and then connect them with the narratives that we feel they will appreciate. And so in conversation with a person, we're constantly negotiating, who am I? Who are you? What are you interested in? What am I interested in? Oh, we have this in common. You say this, and I go, that's actually interesting because that reminds me of this piece over here, which is created by this person with the concept of this, who happens to be a X, and the line of thinking was about this. And the person goes, oh, that's really interesting. Which guitar is that? And we go over and we talk about it. It's not about the specifications. It's not about what pickups are in the guitar, not typically anyways, the technical specs. It really is about what it's contributing to the conversation. And sometimes that is a technical thing. Sometimes it's materiality, like that Polonia guitar, and but that when you talk about a guitar made from a non-traditional, what we call as tone woods, which is a narrative device in itself, right? When we introduce a guitar that's not made from a traditional tone wood, then we have a conversation about what that is. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go too far off track here. But when I showed that Polonia guitar of Brian Gallup's at the Summer NAMM show, C.F. Martin the fourth, so who was the current CEO of the Martin Guitar Company, um, came and looked at the guitar and he said to me, said, yeah, we got some of this Polonia and you can't make a good guitar out of this. We're not going to continue with it. Now, let me thread the needle here for a second on a couple of our points of conversation. One, it's not traditional tone woods, so they found it difficult to make what they consider to be a Martin guitar. And that Martin guitar has a narrative. It has a sonic impression, right? And has what the customers will expect of a Martin guitar. It's like you don't want to bite into an apple and taste a carrot, right? Like that would be disorienting, right? Especially if you thought you were buying an apple for good reasons. And then the idea also was the system that is put into place to get the result from that. Whereas Brian Gallup's approach to that tone wood was not to treat it exactly as he would treat a spruce and rosewood and mahogany guitar, the traditional materials. He looked at the material and said, what are the properties of the material? How does it respond? What must I do? And it meant that the top of the guitar was much thicker than he would with a spruce top guitar. And the braces were of a different size. That he had to treat the material differently, not just go on all the assumptions of the existing system and then say that the material is not useful because it doesn't fit into the existing system. You had to adjust the system based on the material input. So, and the existing system is there's a lot of narrative storytelling around what makes a good guitar and how sound functions, but I would argue it's not so different than the observation of a fiery meteorite through the sky, where we
Mm.
have an empirical evidence and then we take our experience and we create a narrative around it and say, well, this is the science of it. This is why it works. Because actually, I think a lot of the science that we talk about in the guitar community is actually not proved. And science itself is a system of proving or misproving hypotheses and theories. But what we do have is we have a lot of tribal stories based on our empirical evidence, and that we would benefit from reconsidering those ideas. But it's all caught up in those narratives. So, long story long, that's how I tell stories, Ross.
Yes, okay. This will be a challenge, and if we work together, will also be a challenge because
Hmm.
when I'm defining stories, it's the story of a protagonist or a person
Hmm.
whose shoes
Hmm.
the audience will walk in. You set up a series of problems; they either resolve
Hmm.
them or not.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and I think that that's the key distinction between possibly a narrative or content which is telling the story of the guitar. But if you humanize it, the story of, well, the story with Brian Gallup. So the guitar was made, and I have this inanimate object that I have to now elicit an emotional response from my
Mhm.
audience. As a
Mhm. Mhm.
storyteller, I believe that is the fundamental goal, is to create an emotional response. Now,
Mhm.
I'm going to backtrack on this in a second because, I made a film, Fight Club, and it could be argued that there is an intellectual response to the film and maybe not an emotional response. So I think you can stimulate an audience intellectually, um, but you still got to give them characters to care about, somebody that they can
Mhm.
identify with. Somebody described once that a story is like a flight simulator. You get into the cockpit of this machine and you go through the actions of flying, but you're not actually putting yourself at risk. And this is why we enjoy it so much, particularly movies. We go into
Mhm.
this hall, this darkened room, to have a simulation of life. And
Mhm.
often the same experience or the same chemicals as if you're experiencing the actual event are triggered. When we jump in
Mhm.
fear in a horror movie, we actually believe we're
Mhm.
there. So part of
Mhm.
the job of a storyteller is to take the audience into the place so they believe it to be real.
Mhm.
So in the case of the president, the Brian Gallup, so the trees, the Polonia, were pioneered by President Carter on his farm in
Mhm.
Georgia, Plains, Georgia. And uh, during the pandemic, the guitar was being played for, there were 12 guitars made or 12 instruments, and one was being played for President Carter. And I
Mhm.
thought, well, okay, I don't know what the story is. What's the problem? So the problem was this guitar maker was wanting to play for the president during lockdown. And then I found a quote from President Carter when he was president. And he said, if you have an instrument and a voice, you'll always be welcome in my home. And that was the light bulb moment. Here we have a pandemic where no one's welcome in your home. So I'm
Yeah.
going to make you, President Carter, a liar. So that was my setup for the story. All this footage of the luthier going to President Carter's home, playing the guitar in the garden, a safe distance away, everybody
Mhm.
wearing masks. Um, and there, President Carter honored his own words. He was not a liar. He did welcome him into his home, took the precautions
Yeah.
needed, and got to hear what a renewable resource sounds like. So
Mhm. Mhm.
now, I'm not sure. The film's been watched by over 1 million people, partly because of the lure of President Carter. But I think the story
Mhm.
did move people.
Mhm. What
It
was the name of the
connected
film
us
again?
with some. It's just a short film. It doesn't have a name.
Oh,
It's like 4.5 minutes.
where could we see it?
I'll say
Ah,
it
okay. All
should
right.
be.
We'll include it in the when we post this online. Great.
Yes, yeah.
Mhm.
Now, it was filmed by, sorry, President Carter's carer. So his nurse filmed it on her iPhone. So it's rough,
Yes.
um, but so that's important in how do you, your job is to convey information, but wrap it in an emotional story. Now,
Sure.
coming back to Ernest Hemingway, in some ways,
Mhm.
this was a hook, right? I set this up 2 minutes ago. Hopefully, the audience
Mhm.
are still listening because they want to hear this 6-word story. And
Yeah.
again, knowing that the job is to create an emotional response. So, a
Mhm.
story is often a setup, complications, resolution.
Mhm.
So, his 6 words were, I've got to get the order right. Baby shoes, for sale, never worn.
Hmm.
Did you have any? What was your response to that? Emotional response.
It's sad. It's sad. It's slightly tragic. The idea that baby shoes were acquired, presumably at the excitement of new life, and they're being passed on without being used. Um, that's the assumptions. Of course, there are possibilities where the baby was born and just never fit the shoes, or you forgot about them and found them in the closet afterwards. You could write a story where it's not tragic, but the initial response is, "Oh, that's tragic." Yeah,
Right. But what is in key is the order of the words. If I'd said,
sure.
uh, baby shoes never worn for sale, it would change the impact. So, as storytellers, we have to craft. Uh, well, okay, let's stop for a sec. What is a story? If an alien came to Earth, Jamie, and you had to describe to them, they have no idea what a story is, what would you tell them?
Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop is your premier fretted instrument custom case maker, and we invite you to create a musical instrument case unlike any other, one that's unique to you. Every Cedar Creek custom case is hand built by highly skilled craftspeople using only select woods, Providence Forge hardware, and premium instrument friendly materials. At Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop, we are dedicated to helping you design the case of your dreams. Find out more at cedarcreekcases.com. Well, we'd be in conversation already, and so that's interesting, right? So, I mean, first of all, this is not a first statement. So it has a lead up and a context. And so if I had to tell them a story, then given a moment to think about it, I would probably give them some rendition of the hero's journey, like you talked about. There is someone, they have some complications, they overcome the complications. The part that makes it the hero's journey is when they overcome the complications, they now have some sort of superpower or boons in which to bestow upon their fellow man, right? And so we all relate to that, and so yeah, do I have to give a specific story? But it would be something
Oh,
along that lines. Yeah.
that's very very good. Often I'm with writers who are dedicated writers, even though they're expanding their craft into screenwriting, and I ask them, "You're a storyteller. Tell me what a story is," and it
Mm,
stumps people, and it's not easy.
mm,
But I think it's a character facing a series of events arranged
mhm,
in a specific order to make the audience feel something. And we can elaborate, and there are many variations
mhm.
on that, but that's
Yeah,
it. Because
sure.
someone said, "Oh, it's not like a series of events, because a train timetable is a series of events, but there's no
Yeah.
emotional. Moses' Ten Commandments is a series of events,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
it's structured way to make them feel something."
Yes.
Um,
So, that's funny because actually before our meeting, I looked up the definition of narrative, and I have to say, I scrolled and scrolled because I didn't like the definitions of narrative that I have found, because the definition of narratives were all so very simple that they were a written or oral story. Like, it was so very simple in the Oxford Dictionary or something, and much to my dismay, because I wished to make myself sound more intelligent, I didn't want to use Wikipedia. But Wikipedia was the most modern definition I could find. And the narrative definition of Wikipedia is: a narrative, story, or tale is any account of a series of related events or experiences, whether non fictional or fictional. Now, narratives can be presented through a sequence of written or spoken words, through still or moving images, or through any
mhm.
combination of these. And the reason that I wanted a definition that included that is because we've already talked about that. I'm a storyteller as well, but my storytellers are specifically around craft objects for the most part, or concepts or theories. And I had recently been reading a book written by Peter Korn called Why We Make Things and Why It Matters. And I actually wanted to pull apart something here with the narrative, which I thought you and I could discuss, because it actually juxtaposes the written story and the story of an object. And so, if I can read it to you for a second here, and then we can discuss if we can. Again, he's a furniture maker, And so he says, although both furniture and books carry ideas, there are significant differences between them, such as how they sequence the information. Reading text is a linear progression where one idea or follows another, like the news crawl at the bottom of a television screen. On the positive side, this gives a writer significant control of the step by step process through which the reader accesses ideas. On the downside, only one thought can be presented at a time. The remainder of the author's composition is either receding to the netherworlds of memory or invisibly waiting in the wings for its moment on stage. In contrast, a craft object is a collage in which many pieces and levels of information are read in relationship to each other in the present. So when I look at a piece of furniture from across the room, I see form, style, scale, context, and intended use. As I approach it, I distinguish material, joinery, and proportions. And when I get close enough to touch it, I take in details such as hardware, textures, finish, edge treatments, wood grains, quality, and comfort. A craftsman cannot control a respondent's path through the information as tightly as an author, but the craftsman has the advantage of making complex structures of information simultaneously apparent. His picture is worth the proverbial 1,000 words. Well written, right? So that was Peter Korn, Why We Make Things and Why It Matters. And just the idea that we're sequencing the events, you're taking them down the path. You're choosing, as you talked about, the sequence of the events, and you're guiding them through. But in my world, where we're guitar makers and we're creating a craft object, and I present a number of guitars in front of people that are provocative, interesting guitars often, I can't control the flow of information. I don't get to choose what they get to see.
No, that's true. So what you're saying is the composition of this object is a
Mhm.
story. Um,
As everything is. I mean, everything in our world has a narrative structure. I mean, if I were to look at this cup, what is it? Technically, it's a vessel that contains liquid effectively in one space, in which we use to then guide the liquid from this space into our space, right?
okay, okay,
That's a technical description. But when we look at it, we say cup. We don't think any of that stuff, but we know it. It's already part of the narrative that we've learned and lives within us. As a matter
true.
of fact,
Okay,
there's been
here's
psychological studies done on this where there are people who have they have no inhibition, meaning that if there is a door, they must walk through the door. They don't have the control to not walk through the door. And what psychologists learn from this is, oh, door doesn't mean wooden object with a doorknob space. Door means something to walk through to the brain, which means door has a narrative structure. It's not a fundamental object. It is a story, which makes everything in
all
the world
right.
is then a story.
But the one thing that we're missing in this, and was
Yeah.
missing in the definition of narrative that you read, is
Hmm.
eliciting an emotional response.
Well,
So
some stories
the
fail to do that. It's still a
oh, they
story.
do, right? But still,
You're qualifying stories. You
yes, I am. I am because
So
I believe there
I'll
is a
accept your
narrative, a
qualifier.
story.
Go on.
See, I think we use narrative and story interchangeably, and narrative is the bigger overarching
Hmm.
thread or theme, and a story is an individual part of a narrative. So you can have 10 stories inside a narrative. Um, but I think that, again, if it's to engage an audience, to make them remember, to um, involve them, engage them, then there is a degree of uh, manipulation, and I use that word kindly, on the part of
Hmm.
the creator, the author, because
Yeah,
we're doing it to get that response. Hemingway wrote that order of 6 words to get a response. That's a manipulation.
sure.
So, yes, you say,
Yes,
okay, the viewer, it's up to them to interpret the story, but still doesn't mean I create the story without an intention
Of
Um,
course.
so the audience will receive it as they receive it. And that was the big thing in making a film. You release it into the world and you get this negative reaction, positive reactions. And I keep thinking, I want to explain myself to get people to understand where it came from. And someone said,
Yes.
let it go. It's theirs. Once the audience receive
Yeah.
it, it's theirs. It's no longer yours. Um,
Yes.
Now, I think I've gone a little off tangent there, but I
The
still
story
struggle
to
with the
elicit
idea.
response, which is an idyllic bit of storytelling. And I wish it were always true. Certainly when I'm talking with some people and feel like I can't get away from this story because they are failing to connect, which we've all experienced
Right.
that.
Now, I'm going to need your help here. So at NAM in Anaheim just a couple of weeks ago, I met
Hmm.
one of your luthiers, guitar makers from Portugal, who was making guitars from the barrels of old wine barrels from old vineyards. What
Yes,
was
there were
his
two
name?
guitar makers. That's a set of a series, but you were either speaking with Michael Spalt or Adriano Sergio. So was he
Adriano.
actually Portuguese or was he
Yes, he was. He
Viennese?
was.
Adriano. Okay, so it's Adriano Sergio of Aragon guitars. Yep.
And he was talking, he showed me the guitar, and there were all these scrape marks on it. And so
Hmm.
I'm looking, thinking, okay, the guitar for me was not a story in itself. When he told me how those scrape marks were on the wood, it was children that used to go into the barrel 200 years ago to clean
Yes.
the tannin and the residue off the inside of the barrel, and only children could fit in
Yeah.
that. And I
Yeah.
thought,
Yeah.
now there's the story. You could actually tell the story of how the guitar came to be through
Hmm.
that very personal. I'm not saying specifically a journey of a child. There are many ways to do it, but
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
gave me uh, the wrapping to present the guitar in a story that would move, educate, inform people. So that could have been part of a bigger story about a bigger narrative about
Yes.
sustainability. You know, here we are
Yeah.
recycling wood, and then you could see a collector thinking, "I want that guitar because of the story." Um,
Absolutely. So, matter of fact, you know that because we've discussed it, that wood was part of a documentary movie called The Barrel Project, where they realized there were six guitar makers involved, and one of the guitar makers, Uli Teufel, had realized the timing of how old this wood was, uh, put it in sequence with the earthquake that destroyed Lisbon in the 17th century, which was one of the triggers of the Enlightenment, because. Uh, Well, as the people were trying to understand scientifically what had happened and that their science was really more superstition at the time, they said the government and church, which was kind of one in Lisbon at the time, said, well, God is angry. And that's why the earthquake happened here because of all this sin in Lisbon. And the people said, well, why are why did all the churches get destroyed, but the brothels are still standing? Real story. If God is angry, why did he destroy his churches and why are the brothels still standing? And so that was one of the triggers to questioning this narrative that we have around our government and religious thinking about
mhm.
why things are happening. And today, when an earthquake happens, not many of us think that, oh, God is angry with us. We think about tectonic plates and, movements of the earth and and was anyone fracking here? Which I don't think they were in the 17th century, but those are parts of the narrative now. And so you're absolutely right. I was there for the release of the Barrel Project. I flew to Lisbon. I was there at the palace of, I believe, it's the Marquis de Bombay, um, with the guitar makers, and I saw the original release of the film, which was played at the winery at the palace outside. And that's exactly one of the reasons I want to talk with you was projects like that, because I've been involved with many of them, and absolutely we bring greater value to these built objects by inferring a deeper meaning. And how do we infer the deeper meaning? We infer the deeper meaning through stories and through narratives. And some people say, well, I remember Someone else who I think you've had some contact with, George Gruen, was at a show at the Summer NAMM show, and on the Boutique Guitar Showcase, we don't sell guitars directly. We always work with our retail partners, and our retail partner in Nashville was Gruen Guitars. And so George came by the booth, and there was a guitar there that was made from reclaimed wine barrels from Leonardo da Vinci's family, and it was part of a big anniversary. And George said, "Nobody's gonna buy a Telecaster made from Da Vinci wine barrels for $20,000." Well, I got called in for a press call the next morning, and I had to do an interview with the morning breakfast shows at 5:30 in the morning. And we did the breakfast call, and one of the people, one of the person who's doing the news call always decides the feature. I showed them around, and they say, "Well, let's talk about that one, this one, that one." So they did. It went out on breakfast television, and we get an email. Someone wants to buy one of these guitars. Say, "Well, we have to do this through one of our retail partners." So I contact George. Say, "George, we've got a customer who wants to buy a guitar. I need you to take their money." He's like, "Really? What is it?" I said, "It's one of those $20,000 wine barrel Telecasters that nobody's gonna buy." He said, "Really?" I said, "Yeah." "Did you think George took his money?" The answer is yes. Yes, George took the money. And I don't say that to make fun of George. I think that it's an it shows us that some stories connect to some people and they don't connect to others. And some say,
Right.
"I don't care anything about that story about the wine barrels and Leonardo da Vinci and these guitars made in Tuscany." And someone else says, "Oh wow, I'm a huge fan of Da Vinci and maybe wine and guitars, and this connects all the dots for me. This is my love language. Can I please buy that
Right.
guitar?" And they make the
But
investment.
still, the reason the stories become important is you don't know who they're going to affect and catch and bring in. So if the goal is to build traffic to Boutique Guitar Showcase and a
Hmm, hmm.
story about children chiseling the inside of a wine barrel that
Yeah,
becomes a guitar, you don't know who that's going to get shared with, passed on, and bring people in. Sorry, my thing's going off. Well, George Gruen has a really interesting story because he loves reptiles. And I remember the first time I
yes.
spoke to him, because I'm Australian, he was talking to me
Mm,
about snakes. I think, I'm calling you about guitars, right? But
yeah. I have a picture of George
in
and him and I with both holding snakes. I also happen to like reptiles and have a history in herpetology also. And I remember that there is an Australian carpet python in that shot. There's absolutely an
oh,
Australian python in George's collection in that photograph. Yeah, yeah.
it's great. But what it did was, in telling me that story, it sort of disarmed me in a way, and it brought me closer to him. And it was
Hmm,
not, manufactured. It was him being
hmm.
him.
Yeah,
And then you realize how much stories, without knowing it, how much they influence the way we communicate and present ourselves. And
yeah.
the growing thing in psychotherapy is the whole idea of stories. You're the protagonist in your own story, and you can rewrite that.
Hmm,
Um,
hmm.
but that's a tangent. Uh,
That's all right.
it's all stories. It's all stories.
So,
We're born,
so
and then
you've
we tell stories. Right.
yeah. So can we talk about the form in which the story takes place for a second? Because one of the things I tried to juxtapose in that quote from that book was specifically about the object versus the written word. Now, of course, some of the things that you're best known for as the producer of Fight Club, which is a cult classic at this point in time, and part of that story is so well ingrained because I won't say every time, but I'm going to say maybe 60% of the time that if I have mentioned to someone you and your connection to Fight Club, say, "Do you know the movie Fight Club?" And the auto response 60% of the time, of course, is no, or there is no Fight Club. They which is, of course, one of the main lines, the first two rules of Fight Club. And so it's it's so ingrained within the culture, that part of the story, that it literally changed the way that we think, and there's an auto response to that. Now that's moving pictures. There's the craft object. There's the written word. And if it's okay, I'm gonna these are probably way too long for this format, but I decided when I do this podcast, I'm going to do basically kind of whatever the hell I want, and we'll see where it goes. And I hope that there's people who have patience for my long-winded ways sometimes. But there's this great quote from Walter Cronkite when he wrote the introduction of a book called Photographs That Changed the World that I have on my bookshelf. And Walter Cronkite, of course, being the famous American television newscaster, he writes here that television, which I have served for almost 40 years, is a remarkable high impact medium. That instantaneously transmission of pictures and sound is close to a miracle. If this miracle has a flaw, it is its lack of one important feature, and this is contemplation, which motion
Mm.
defies. A good still photograph studied by an inquiring mind frequently yields more information than a mile of moving images. Without contemplation, comprehension sometimes suffers. And so when you are presenting your medium in a moving picture, the written word, a still shot, look at a meme, which are so popular these days, right? People sending
Mhm.
out pictures of quotes, still images of quotes is very popular to do at this point. Um, or a sculptural object, a tensioned object, which is what a guitar is often, in our case. Um, what do you think about utilizing these different mechanisms for storytelling? And do you think about that? Do you think about whether this particular bit of information is better in a still image, a moving image, written on a page, or ever even an object?
Well, see, there's an economic angle to that, which is if I'm making my money as a film producer, no, I'm not going to think about any other alternative. Because you don't want to give the studio any out. They've got to say, yes, this is a movie. Because, Fight Club was a book,
Yeah.
which then became the movie. And, it could have been a TV series. For me, it was always, how do you reach the widest audience? I started in Australia in theatre.
Hmm.
And the idea of putting on a show that maybe 60, 80 people saw in a little theater a night just didn't cut it for me. I thought all that work, and I love theater, don't get me wrong, but all that work for very little possibility of reaching audience.
Sure.
Now we've moved from films to memes and social media. The democratization of media is what we're witnessing now, where anybody with an idea, or even not even an idea, anybody with a camera, a phone, can tell a story. So, I think there are some stories that are better done as a poem than they are as a film. And there are, you know, literary masterpieces that have been turned into terrible movies. So I think some stories fit
Hmm.
certain firms better, right?
Yeah.
Um, but when I read the manuscript for Fight Club, because it hadn't been published yet, I'm reading this very funny but bleak story. Because in the
Hmm.
book, the characters are burning themselves with cigarettes, all the stuff that any studio is going to object to. So I'm thinking,
Hmm.
oh, this is better left as a book. I don't want to see this. I don't want to see people burning themselves with cigarettes. Um,
Hmm.
and then, spoiler alert, I'm going to tell people the twist. If you
Yeah.
want to mute, yeah, I'm going to tell you what happens. So you're reading the book, and suddenly you realize these two characters that you thought were separate characters are the same person. And it was like, it was like a trapdoor opened, and I fell through the trapdoor into this deeper well of understanding. And everything I'd read, I had to reassess. And it was
Hmm.
electrifying. I thought, this is a movie. That's when I knew it was a movie. Now, in developing the film, all the stuff like the burning of cigarettes on each other's skin, we left that out. That got cut. So I started to
Hmm.
shape it, because an adaptation is not just filming what was. You have to interpret it, shift it to fit this new medium. And um, including, we came up with a whole new ending to the story that was not in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember Chuck Palahniuk, the author, when he read our script, said, "Oh, you understood what I was trying to do more than I did." And
Mm-hmm.
because we sort of wrap things up in a way by blowing up the credit card companies, that was the actual destruction of the world. Because if we all refused to pay our debts, capitalism would collapse. And
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned my economics degree earlier. That came from studying, debt, global
Yeah.
debt. If we all said let's not pay, that's the end of the system. Now, in the book,
Mm-hmm.
the character blows up a building to fall onto the Natural History Museum as a symbolic destruction of the world. Well,
Mm-hmm.
we went a step further and made it actual. But by blowing up the credit card companies, nobody was harmed and everybody believed they were set free. If I was told I didn't have to pay my debts, I'd be elated.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's a long-winded way or a tangential way of saying that the medium does determine how the story is told. So we change things from the book to the film.
Mm-hmm.
Now, could Fight Club have been done as a photograph? No. Um, could it have been done as a sculpture? Yes, I'm sure somebody's been inspired to do that. But to an audience of what? I want the ideas in Fight Club are so uh, exciting and profound to me that you have to break yourself apart to evolve. You have to
Mm-hmm.
face your fears. Stop living your IKEA furniture and set yourself free. Basically,
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was so fundamental to my journey and to most people's journey. If you're honest, we all have Tyler Durden telling us don't do that, take that risk, try this, right? And we all silence
Mm-hmm.
that. And in Fight Club, he wasn't silenced; he came out. Um, so
Mm-hmm.
that was a way of saying that the ideas for me in the film were so important; it had to reach a wide audience. Somebody suggested, "Why don't you do it as a Broadway musical?" And I thought, "Oh my God, the economics of Broadway musicals is, the people who come to New York for the weekend and they go and
Yeah.
see Cats and they see right. They're not going to come and see a
Yes.
musical on
Yes.
Fight Club." So
Yeah. Yeah.
um, but if you did an underground theatre production of it, I'm sure it could be, galvanizing, but your reach is going to be quite small. Um,
Yeah.
so this is a challenge, I think, for all artists, and it'd be interesting to apply this to Luthier. Is are
Mm-hmm.
you thinking of your audience? Are you thinking of the end player with a guitar? Because in the
Mm-hmm.
studio system, you have to. It's such an expensive proposition to make a film. You've got to be thinking, how
Mm-hmm.
do we get our return on our investment?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
Well, sometimes the guitar makers suffer from the anti-story. Often, when I ask a guitar maker to tell me about their guitar, they literally tell me about their guitar. They tell me about the specs of the instrument. They tell me about the the quality of screws they're using, the materials and all the specifications of the instrument, like I'm reading a an owner's manual, which very few people do. I mean, the irony of owner's manuals is that we all understand nobody reads owner's manuals, right? And so um, I often try and help guitar makers with that. And actually, a big role for what I do is often I will tell someone how I see their guitar and why it fits into what we're doing. And they'll go, "Oh, I need to write that down." You see them stop. Like, "Can you send that to me? Can you say that again?" And because they feel like that's possibly the best description they've ever heard of their instrument. And what's interesting to me is sometimes how somebody can work so closely on something for so long, because they're usually working on this for, of course, many years before I ever meet them, right? uh and yet um they don't understand how it fits into the world as a part of our greater narrative, and that we connect with things through the story, not through the specifications necessarily. And the role of storytellers is interesting, and how often you tell them, stop doing that, stop talking, stop giving bullet points, stop telling
Right.
all the
Yes.
specifications.
Yes. But
Yeah,
here's a story, okay? And when we were doing the Polonia instruments, so
yeah,
World Tree harvested President Carter's acres of Polonia.
yeah.
And they came up with the idea of doing the President Carter legacy collection of 12 stringed
Hmm.
instruments, mandolins, ukuleles, and guitars.
Hmm.
And a man by the name of Todd Lundgren,
Hmm.
no, no, that's the Todd. Oh, fuck. I've got to get this right. Todd Lernerberg. He went out and found luthiers to make these 12 instruments.
Okay,
And one of them was a guy called Drew Heineman, who was a tour guide on the Boundary Waters National Park on the border of the US and Canada.
okay.
And the reason he agreed to be part of this building of the guitar was that President Carter, when he was president, signed into law the expansion of this wilderness area, protection for this wilderness area. And then
Hmm.
part of the guitar was made from a tree that had fallen in the wilderness area. And so he was using Polonia grown by President Carter with a top that was made by from spruce from a tree that had fallen in the
Hmm.
a derecho, which is this huge wind that had gone through.
Yeah.
And so he had a very personal connection to this. But the story in the guitar for President Carter was, thank you for preserving this wilderness area. Thank you for
Hmm.
promoting sustainability by growing the tree. Maybe that's a long-winded story, and I didn't tell it as well as I should have, being a storyteller. But it was a very
Yeah, yeah.
personal connection to President Carter, who, when he heard the story, otherwise he's just getting a guitar, right? But
Sure.
when he heard the
Yeah.
story of what this man had put into it and the reason, the choices he'd made, it was quite
Yes.
emotional for him to receive that.
Yeah.
Just quickly, I know I'm going on about Carter, but there was another guitar made by
Hmm.
Jason
Hmm.
Costell in Arizona, also made
Yes.
of Polonia. And
Hmm.
Jason is an army man, Carter
Hmm.
was a navy man, and there's a great
Hmm.
rivalry between the two in terms of
Right.
sports. And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
in the design of Jason's guitar,
Yes.
on the back, there was a series of dashes and dots, and it looked like just part of the design, but
Hmm.
it was
Hmm.
Morse code. It was Morse code, and when you read it, it said "Beat Navy." So the story of this rivalry, and when Carter, he just laughed so hard that someone had gone to that degree of thought to
Yeah.
code line a
Yes.
message. Well, those are the stories that you sell now.
Yeah.
Um, so you could tell 1,000 stories about the same object, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's
And there, there's, yeah, there's lots of connection there. Jason is also produces. He makes guns. Also, he makes guns and he makes guitars, and so he's a very competent marksman. And so, anyways, it's yeah, he's not shy about talking about it. It's not normally promoted, but he does let people know that. And so, um, to understand Jason Kossel and to understand his instruments, is to partly understand his history as a American veteran. For sure,
right.
that's part of his story for sure, and he regularly tells those stories when he's asked to speak at symposiums and such. In fact, I recently was with Jason at the Northwood seminar, and Jason was telling the story about, yeah, falling in
About the
helicopters and being shot,
oh,
and
oh,
many of those stories, but the military always comes up in his stories nonetheless, and so, but that's part of the narrative of how you connect to Jason Costel and whether you care about those things or not, and why you might choose to. And it's very normal for us to be. I'll be standing with a customer, we'll be looking at the all the guitars in the Boutique Guitar Showcase on tour, and uh, it's quite common for me to say to them, so these aren't companies, these are these are people. These are people who chose to often be introspective, reflect upon who they are and what's important to them, and then they're inspired to create something, and then they have the courage to share what they created with the world, which is, it takes courage. It takes courage to share that, because we're always concerned about how we're being judged, on those
Mm,
things.
mm.
And the flip side of that, of course, is the great value that we feel when it's well received. That someone
Yeah.
found value in the thing that you shared of yourself and created value from. And so when I talk with guitar makers who are struggling to find their way, that's what I do. When I speak in guitar making schools, which I do about a half a dozen a year or so, I always share with the students: be introspective, be honest about what you find, and then have the courage to share that honesty in your craft. And you will create
Mm.
something that is unique, because you are not like the other people in this room. Every one of you is unique. And if you share a piece of yourself within your craft object, it will it will be different than the other ones. The Boutique Guitar Showcase on tour will make its first ever Asian appearance at Sound Mess Osaka in Osaka, Japan, May 11th and 12th, 2024. You can experience many incredible, unique, world-class guitars, meet some of their makers, and speak with me, Jamie Gale, the curator of the Boutique Guitar Showcase, at this landmark event. Find out more at boutiqueguitarshowcase.com. Yeah.
You've just brought up two directions I want to go. So I just want to finish quickly with
Mm.
Jason Costell. When you
Yes.
include the President Carter video, it's Jason, it's Jason's guitar that is being played by Todd
Yeah.
Lenneberg. And
Yes.
and then Todd gets Jason to FaceTime him, and he's able to hold it up to President Carter. So in the film, it's Jason talking to President Carter,
Yes.
filmed by the nurse. So that's
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
finishing the story.
Yeah.
But what you just said then was really key. And the studios forget this all the time. The universal is in the particular. The
Mm.
specifics of someone's story, the studios try to round everything off to get that greatest audience, right?
Mm-hmm.
Don't
Mm-hmm.
don't threaten, don't poke the bear, don't be too edgy, right? They try to round everything off.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
the more specific you are, the more people connect to that authenticity, and it actually resonates a much more universal theme.
Yeah.
And what people realize now, that the shows that often work in terms of the streaming universe are that true authorial voice. They want
Mm.
what you have, not the
Mm-hmm.
rounded out version. So a guitar maker,
Ambiguity.
the more yeah, but the more
Mm-hmm.
specific you are, the more um, it makes it for greater distinction, of course, but
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
people will respond to it in ways that the marketing people think they won't. Um, because
Well,
there's some pretty
the,
specific stuff in Fight Club, and you sort of
yeah.
sit back and go, studio want a lot of it changed, a lot of it changed. Um,
Yeah.
but thankfully, David Fincher, the director, held his ground, and it became the conversation piece. If it didn't become a hit, it's not in its box office release. It wasn't a hit. It's done very well as a DVD, but that market's now gone. Um, so in some ways, the studios know what they're doing in trying to bland everything to get the biggest return.
To a certain
Yeah,
extent, but they're always dealing with historical references, and we deal with the same problem with the stories around the guitar and marketing. Also, is that there's the legacy companies which sell what has been and what is, um, and there's always a lot of resistance towards unknown ideas, right? And
right,
so we
right.
talk about acceptance curves, and of course, some of the great stories we'd hear about this is that nobody, including the people who were cast in the film of Star Wars, believed it was going to be a hit. Right? They all joked about it. The cameramen, the actors, all joked about what a ridiculous movie they were making during this process. And George Lucas had a different vision for it. And he had the wherewithal to say, I'm going to license this product and I need to have all the rights to this, right? So he made a serious genre for sci-fi fantasy. Two, he showed that there was a way to create memorable objects that relate to the story. that can be sold so that people can connect with the story over and over and over again in perpetuity for now many decades later. At this point in time, we're almost 50 years to the release of Star Wars, 77, yeah, 3 years away from 50 years. And then in addition to that, in order to tell his story, he didn't run the credits at the beginning of the film, and he was kicked out of the Screenwriters Guild for Star Wars. I don't know if you know that. So Star Wars
I
was the
didn't know.
very first movie to ever not roll the credits, and to roll the credits at the beginning of the film was a mandatory part. He was fined and he was kicked out of the Screenwriters Guild, and he had to fund the second movie himself. He wasn't officially a part of it. And so now, of course, it's very the only people who run credits at the beginning are people who are making some sort of historical reference, right? So he changed the world on three planes at least with Star Wars. And so, we can reference history, we can take the safe route often. But of course, heroes aren't made by taking the safe road. The heroes are made by taking some impossible risk and it paying off. Of course, there's a lot of tragedies we
Yeah.
don't hear about in those scenarios, but we want to hear about that sort of hero's journey. And, in the Boutique Guitar Showcase, we have a number of people who have taken that sort of risky route who these days it's paying off. And I'm thinking about people like Sheldon Dingwall and Ned Steinberger with the headless guitar. I know these might not mean a lot to you, but the guitar without a peg head on it right now is a really growing marketplace. And Ned Steinberger and I have had a number of conversations about this. And he's like, no one is more surprised that the headless guitar is back and thriving than I am. The guy who invented effectively the headless guitar in 1977 is like pleased and shocked as to that it's there and that it's thriving, and so there's a great
Well,
satisfaction. They're having uh, that sort of elated sort of feeling of wow, I stuck my neck out there and people laughed at it and people criticized it and they said it was never going to work and here we are. They're now, yeah, the hero.
well, what I loved about being at the Guitar Showcase in Anaheim was walking around talking to a lot of these luthiers and guitar makers. And it was such a personal story that they told of often being other or isolated, or their
Yeah.
creativity went into these creations. And that was the kind of specificity that makes it universal. We've all felt that. But they just had the gumption, the skill, the determination to channel that otherness into these incredible designs. And the one
Yeah.
that particularly struck me, and it's a story I've told since, and again, I apologize for forgetting his name, uh, Swiss chap, young Swiss luthier, who had read a
Hmm.
book by Brian May, where Brian May, the guitarist from Queen,
Giulio
um,
Negrini, G&G Guitars, Italian,
sorry,
but living in Switzerland. He lives in
my
Switzerland, but
bad,
he's Italian by birth. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Julia,
So,
yes.
yes,
And he told the
Brian May, the
story
book.
of reading, because in the book, Brian May gives directions on how to build a guitar. And this
Very
young
specific
man,
directions. Yes.
very specific, but he did it. He went and
Yeah.
made his first
Yeah.
guitar by following what Brian. And I thought, now that's a
Yes.
story. Without the
Yes.
training, without anything, but a book written by somebody he was a fan of. And
Yeah. It's
so again, that brings me back.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's incredible. The part that maybe we didn't talk about is that he has had the hero's journey because he took that first guitar and he brought it to his sort of his guitar teacher, his kind of hero of the guitar, and he pointed out all the problems with the guitar. And Julia was a bit embarrassed and said that's never going to happen again. And Julia has pursued perfecting that guitar. And one of the things that distinguishes Julio today is his pursuit of perfection and conquering those dragons, and slaying the dragon. And he's become a hero. And I told you today, Julio has a group of people who literally tattoo themselves and meet once a year, as part of a Julio Negrini, fan club, sort of his tribe, they call it, which is fascinating. Yeah.
That that would also be another story to tell. That is
Yeah.
incredible. But I imagine that if that story got told, it would get to Brian May and he would be absolutely honored and blown away by that.
Yes.
Um,
I think you're right. We should do that.
it's yeah, yes. But the other thing
Shall we
is,
do
and
that
I tell
together?
this, yes, let's do it. I want to do it.
Yeah, I want to
So
do
I'll
it.
send you the
And Julio is
I
great. And
propose
so let's connect on this afterwards. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I want to do 4 stories because there is a big story here, and the more I
Yeah.
talk to you, Jamie, the more I know that there is. Maybe we shouldn't talk about this on air, but a documentary series
More
there
to come
is.
later. Yeah. To be continued.
But I
Yeah.
also want you to send me what you read because that was incredible about the object. Um,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. Great book. I'm only halfway through it because I'm moving so slowly through it because he's written it so well. Yeah.
ah,
Yeah. Yeah.
there's something else I was just going to add then about.
Julio, future
No.
stories. There's more to come.
Um, oh, when I'm working with writers,
Hmm.
and myself as a writer, you get to this dead end. You know, you can call it writer's block, whatever, but I don't know how to
Hmm.
solve the
Hmm.
problem. And this is where
Yes.
most people give up, right? And I think,
Hmm.
oh, I'm a bad writer. If I was a good writer, I wouldn't have got into this problem. But that's
Hmm.
exactly where you're meant to be because it's in solving the problem that you create something.
Yes.
So every time you're at a dead end, honor that and go, yes, the breakthrough is about to happen. You have to stay
Yeah.
at it. And that's
Yep.
what I love about that story of Julio just then is that he hit the roadblock, but it was the thing that launched him into creating this, these objects of art that he has done.
Yeah.
So for all those
I'm
listening who are blocked, you're in the right place.
Ah, you can, I have two lessons to talk about there. One is I am famous within my own organization for saying, it's not no, it's just not that way. So
Hmm.
often where people would hear a no, I hear not that way. And I try and find another angle to hit it at. It's not manipulation, it's just they didn't say no to necessarily every bit of the concept. There was a tripping point. And can we remove that obstacle, that barrier to the yes? What is standing in the way, right? And can we remove that obstacle? One. Second, however, is when I had a distribution company, I was really emotionally committed to a particular product that I really loved, still love today. Um, and I watched a Dragon's Den, which is a predecessor to Shark Tank. So the American version is Shark Tank, but the show started in Canada, and it's called the Canadian version was called Dragon's Den. And Kevin O'Leary, who started Shark Tank, was on Dragon's Den, so he made a spin-off in the USA basically. And I watched Kevin O'Leary talk to one guy who came in and he had this product, which was a great product. They believed in it. The Home Shopping Channel had bought it one time and took a bunch of orders, but they didn't. They hit a production problem and they faltered on it. And now he's got the production problem worked out and came back, and the shopping channel wants to own it and license it from him, and send him a royalty. And he didn't want to do it. And O'Leary looked at him and said, I'm out. And said, and I'll tell you why I'm out. I'm out because you don't know when to get out of the way. And that hit me like a ton of bricks because I realized that actually I might have been the problem with this distribution deal that I had, that I wasn't going to be the way that this worked out. And I had to
Right.
learn how to get out of the way and how to let some projects go because I am extremely loyal. I am very committed to making things work. And so uh, there is a point where it's not no, it's not that way. But eventually, you do still need to recognize when you've exhausted all of the reasonable
Mhm.
options and say that your time might be better spent pursuing a
Yes.
different
I look,
question or a different solution.
I have this, look, I agree with you. I've had this fight with many people, but as Winston Churchill said, never, 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 never give up. But at some point, you know,
He's dead.
during the yes, but he did save the world, maybe.
He did. He did. Yeah, possibly. Yeah.
But I
Yes.
remember at Fight Club, I was an independent producer making no money. And you only make
Yeah.
money when you go into production. Development, you don't make any money. And so I was living off my credit cards and I
Yeah.
was $60,000, $70,000 in debt.
Yeah.
And I thought, fuck, when do I give this up? And of
Hmm.
course, then it came to me blowing up the credit card companies. I won't have to pay back this. And so my dire situation financially
Yes.
triggered the ending to the film, which
Y-
differentiates it from the
You
book.
wrote that in
So
because of your overburdened
I
credit
went to the
cards?
right, yeah, yeah,
Great.
because I'd also studied it in my degree, my economics degree, and I went to
Yeah.
Jim, the writer, Jim Alls, and said we need an ending where people are going to cheer and feel free and liberated and happy,
Yeah.
and that's how it came to be. So I could have given up, and Fight Club
Yeah.
may or may not have got made. It would have been made differently, but anyhow, yeah. So when
Yeah.
do you give up? When do you say enough's enough?
Well, the thing
Um,
is identifying the ones that are worth pursuing, the ideas that are getting some traction, because just like any story, any product, anything that people actually are going to exchange their resources for, which is commerce, right? And
mhm,
so
mhm.
we're going to exchange our time and money to sit down in a movie theater and you know give you 2 hours of our time and $50 of our money these days. I think by the time you buy a ticket and a drink, um, that's the exchange. But we don't feel bad about it if we've been very entertained, moved, whatever it happens to be, right? It's the same thing when we have a product that we're selling. In our cases, guitars or a service like the boutique guitar showcase, is that as long as the you feel like you got your value from it,
Mm,
and that works.
mm,
But the part that I often have to remember, and I tell up and coming guitar makers or struggling guitar makers, is if you are independently wealthy and you don't need money for what you're doing, you can make whatever the hell you want. But if you need someone to exchange their hard earned money for what you're
yeah,
doing, then you better meet someone else's need besides your own.
right.
And so the trick is to find something that you find fulfilling personally so it does meet your needs, but also meets someone else's. And in doing so, recently the intellectual Thomas Stoll, who teaches at, oh no, Stanford University, he's almost 100 years old. And when you get that old and as an intellectual, people start asking you, what advice do you leave for future generations? I remember Bertrand Russell was asked this 100 years ago, and now I saw Thomas Stoll asked it recently because he's about 100 years old. And Stoll said this very simple advice. He said, acquire skills people are willing to pay you for. The interviewer waited for a second, thinking there was more to come. That's all he had to say. That was it. Acquire skills people are willing to pay you for. That's a basic economic that's how our society works. And that's now in a community, that's what are you contributing to the community? Are you the person who makes the donation? Are you the person who stacks the chairs? Are you the person who shows up and bakes the cookies? All of us have a role within that, and we need all of those things, right? um but it needs to meet someone else's need and your own. And so for you, you have to find a story and tell it in a way where it meets the needs of, well, hopefully millions of people with many of the variations. Because the economics, if they're only going to pay $20 each or $50 each, you need millions
Right.
to make it
That's
work. With a guitar maker, you better be making something that at least a dozen or 30 people in the world annually will connect with and find a legitimate need for. And then you'll be fulfilled and they'll be fulfilled. And that's economics. That's the what makes the world go round, you know?
Hmm.
So
In
yeah.
all the guitar makers you've worked with, what do you think would be a common motivation for them to get into? Would there be one outstanding motivation for them to have ever embarked on this, on their journeys?
Oh, absolutely, and I don't think they're gonna like to hear the answer. It's a big part of my audience is guitar makers, but truth be told, most guitar makers are nonconformist, and they're a bit sort of anti-establishment, and so there is something that drives them to wanting to work alone on their own interests, and I think many of them would say, "Fucking right." And that's okay. Some of them I'm not so sure are willing to admit that they're anti sort of system or anti-establishment. Um, but it's certainly not the easiest way to make a living. And it's not necessarily the easiest work. Certainly, as they age out, as they get older, you realize, steadiness of hand, ability to stand on your feet all day. If you're resawing your own timber, buying large chunks and cutting it, you realize your body eventually starts to fail you. And they start to think about things like apprentices or do I make a production line or something of the sort. Um, but yeah, it really is this sort of rejection of the system and wanting to live a life of value, to do
Hmm.
something that is meaningful to you and meaningful to others, I think, which is a certain amount of a rejection of the industrial movement. It's the same thing that sort of fired the arts and craft movement in the mid 19th century, is that idea that there's value in people engaging in materials and making things that other people acquire. That why we make things and why it matters. Again, so that would be the main narrative, I would say.
That seems to fit. I mean, they're true artists. I think most artists step out of the norm, maybe anti-establishment, but also it fits with the image of the guitar. Trumpet
Yeah,
players aren't operating out. Trumpet makers aren't operating outside the norm in some ways because it's a much more uh, stand. There's something about a guitar which is revolution. It
yeah,
is, and it captures that.
yeah,
So that makes a lot
and
of sense.
it changes the world. It has changed the world. A few years ago, I had an art piece in the BGS, which was UNESCO sponsored, and I had a United Nations uh, representative come to the NAM show, and I was really surprised to hear their perspective on the matter. They said, every time there's a problem in the world, whether it's war breaks out or famine or a tsunami, something, a natural disaster, in very short order, someone with a guitar shows up and they start singing and they start raising money and they start drawing awareness and they help. And
Mm.
so
Mm.
the United Nations literally sees the guitar as a tool for aid and peace, which was remarkable to hear it from them.
That's
Yeah,
wonderful. You can
yeah,
see that. It's it's seemingly easy to pick it up and play a tune, play music.
yeah,
You can see how people gravitate towards that trumpet. You're hiding your face, right? You can't.
right.
I don't know why I'm
And
obsessed
there's a
with a
certain
trumpet
amount of
because
can
I
you
was.
keep that down in here with the trumpet? It's loud, right? So it makes war calls. You're right. We use a bugle, a trumpet sort of predecessor, to make a loud trumpeting call, right? But yeah, so
You have that image of sitting around the fire, right, and people strumming the guitar and people singing along.
yeah,
Imagine if you pulled out your trumpet.
yeah, absolutely. So so
I'm
anyways,
obsessed with trumpets.
there's jokes amongst musicians that talk about those types of instruments sometimes, and there's a joke I heard years ago that talks about uh what's the difference when you see a guy in a gorilla suit on a motorcycle versus a guy with a trombone on a motorcycle? And like, I don't know. So, well, the guy in the gorilla suit's going to a gig. I'm sorry. I love the trombone. I love New Orleans sort of jazz and all of that. But I mean, these are just the jokes that we tell amongst each other, right? So, anyways, there is a story. There's a narrative. The guitar is an icon of contemporary culture, which has absolutely exceeded the bounds of its utility. It means more to us. That is what life with strings attached is about. It's about the fact that the guitar has somehow made my work valuable to UNESCO, has somehow invited me to meet with the world's first robotic citizen and be part of AI think tanks in New York at Mondo NYC. It has somehow led me to the producer of Fight Club and a professional storyteller with you. And so this object, which should be seen possibly as just a utilitarian thing in which we create music with, has somehow been much more than that. And that is sort of my life with strings attached. And I'm very glad I've been connected to you through the guitar. I certainly feel like I have a richer life for knowing you, Ross. And I really appreciate you taking the time to be here on the podcast today. And I'm really looking forward to working on some projects together. And I hope we get a chance to tell a lot more stories. Thank you.
You've opened a whole new world to me, so I can't thank you enough. It really is eye-opening.
Yeah. Ross, is there a project currently or something if someone wants to connect with you or know about your work and how they would, is there something you want to say in
Yes.
closing here that
Look, if you, the best way, I suppose, is LinkedIn to reach out
Mhm.
to me. Um, I'm
And
really
your LinkedIn
interested in,
name?
is my full name, Ross Grayson Bell. Um,
Yes. Okay.
there was another Ross Bell, so I just include my middle name, which is Grayson.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I'm really interested in people who are changing the status quo, that
Hmm.
out there at the coal face, right at the edge, chipping away to change something for the better. Um, that's what interests me. And we need more of that. And as I said
Hmm.
before, we're born and we tell stories, but stories change the world. And
Hmm.
and I say this to any writer who I work with, and it's not just writers, clients. If you
Hmm.
don't tell this story, who will? And even if it's a very standard story of the boy meets girl or boy meets boy, you're telling it through
Hmm.
your perspective, so it's going to be different.
Yeah.
But I think it was Henry Ford, sorry, Henry Ford said,
Hmm.
believe, believe you can or believe you can't. Either way, you're right. So for those struggling, just believe you can do it and you will. You will. So
Well, great encouraging words. Thank you very much.
thank you, Jamie.
Great time. Thank you for watching and listening. You can find more episodes wherever you listen to your podcasts. And a special thanks to those who support us on Patreon. It's your support that enables us to do this work.